Hello and welcome to Birth Words. This is episode number 65 and it's part 4 in a 4-part series about figured worlds and birth.
Welcome to Birth Words. Words are powerful. What are you doing with yours? In this podcast, birth doula and applied linguistics scholar Sara invites you to be intentional, reflective, and empowering with your language as we come together to honor those who give birth. The work of Birth Words is to elevate the language surrounding pregnancy, birth, and the postpartum period. Nothing in this podcast should be taken as medical advice.
All right, welcome to today's episode. As I mentioned in the welcome, in the introduction, this is the final part of a 4-part series about figured worlds. And if you haven't listened yet to episodes 59, 61, and 63, you may want to stop this episode, go listen to those. They're pretty short, just about 15 minutes each. And if you play them at 1.5 speed, even shorter. And then come back here and join us for the conclusion of that 4-part series. So like I said, figured worlds and birth is the topic we're wrapping up today. And I'm going to go back to that quote from James Paul G., where he talks about what do we mean when we say figured worlds and birth. He says, for any communication, ask what typical stories or figured worlds the words and phrases of the communication are assuming and inviting listeners to assume. What participants, activities, ways of interacting, forms of language, people, objects, environments, and institutions, as well as values, are in these figured worlds. So brief recap, a figured world is kind of the simplified mental picture that you have of something, a topic. You say high school prom, what pops into your mind? You say grocery shopping, what pops into your mind? And when we converse about these things, that's when we kind of refer to and shape these figured worlds. So in previous episodes, we've talked about the common assumptions about what are the participants, activities, ways of interacting, forms of language, people, and objects in figured worlds. And in today's episode, we'll be focusing on environments, institutions, and values. But before we jump into that and talk about the typical and assumed environments, institutions, and values of giving birth, I wanted to make a note and an apology. I've been thinking back and talking with others about these last 3 episodes I made, 59, 61, and 63, about figured worlds. And I've realized that I have been very narrow-minded in these episodes on figured worlds. I've titled the episodes Assumptions because they're about the assumptions that people make when they talk about prepare for and experience birth. But I've also made a fair number of assumptions myself while I was making these episodes. I've assumed that most of my listeners are like me. That may currently be the case. I hope that it isn't entirely the case, and I hope that as the podcast continues to grow, that will be less and less true. I've talked about the assumptions we make about birth through my own personal lens, colored by my own position and privileges. I have privileges not due to anything I've done personally myself, but because of my socioeconomic class and because of my race. Though I may feel from my perspective that the birthing system is broken, I haven't recognized how it does serve me because of these privileges, which I underscore. These privileges are because of a broken system that treats white bodies above black and brown bodies, and that is made to serve the middle class, while those without inherited economic privilege are terribly underserved by the system. So though I've been pointing out inequities from my point of view, I recognize that it is one of privilege that doesn't come again because of anything that I have done to deserve that, but because I am part of a system that is broken inherently. So I offer my apologies for neglecting to note this narrow perspective that I've had as I've made these episodes. If you feel compelled to share your story with me, your figured world, and how it impacts the experience of pregnancy and birth, I would be honored to hear your story, especially if it is different from mine. I've also assumed throughout these episodes that most of my listenership lives in the US, which, though it may now be true, certainly doesn't need to be true, and I acknowledge that I'm quite unfamiliar with how birth and healthcare systems work in other countries. And again, if you want to share your story with me, I would love to hear it. Now, with those things said, and keeping in mind that I do come to this conversation with a limited lens and perspective, that I'm working to widen and broaden, but continue to be limited, let's discuss today's topics about environments, institutions, and values in common figured worlds of birth. So when people are having a conversation about birth, what sort of assumptions are they making about the environment in which that happens, the institution that it happens as a part of, or institutions, and the values that are in place there? I feel like I'm going to be scraping the surface on these things, and there's so much more to say, but let me share for the next few minutes a few of my thoughts about these topics. Environments and institutions, to begin with, often are conflated in my mind. I think, okay, in the US, most people give birth in a hospital, which therefore means they give birth in the hospital environment and in the institution of the hospital setting, and it kind of all gets conflated in my mind. But let's try to separate them and think about these things separately. So environment, Merriam-Webster Online says environment means the circumstances, objects, or conditions by which one is surrounded. So when we are talking about giving birth, people have this simplified picture in their mind of what that looks like, and particularly what the environment is. What circumstances, objects, and conditions are there making up that environment? And we've talked about objects already. We've talked in the last episode in this series, episode 63, we talked about monitors, we talked about not so comfy beds, and what those different objects do in that space, and what objects we could choose to focus on instead in our conversation as we seek to craft new figured worlds in the minds of those that we converse with about birth. But when we're talking about environment, creating a peaceful and positive birth environment is one of my main roles as part of being a doula. I talk with my clients beforehand about the things that they can do to create an environment that they'll feel most comfortable in, whether that means music or scents, their own clothes, hanging signs around the room, having little twinkle lights. But that's largely because most of them do give birth in the hospital, and it's a rather unfamiliar environment, and it's an environment that has a certain flavor that comes along with it if we don't try to make it our own. In the hospital, we have, again, beeping machines, needles, monitors, all the sorts of objects that create a medical environment. We pretend that birth is sanitary. Of course, it's important to reduce the risk of infection and transmission, but there's often just like this big focus on the blue tray at the time of the birth of the baby, and not touching anything because that's sanitary, and babies aren't sanitary when they're born. Vaginas out of which babies come aren't sanitary, like as in they're not sterile. That's the word I'm looking for. Sorry, not sanitary, but sterile. So as we emphasize this sterility of birth, what other aspects of birth are we sterilizing as we adopt the sterility of the hospital environment? And again, I want to focus on it is important to be clean and to reduce transmission of germs, to wash our hands. And I'm not saying that we should be touching all of the objects on the sterile blue tray, but I'm just wondering if we focus so much on sterility, what we're missing out on in the environment of birth. And maybe it's those things that you can bring, like music and scents in your own clothes, and things that bring a sense of normalcy and individuality and love and family to the birth space. So next, institution. So when I think of an institution, I think of like a building, a structure, a system, right? So a hospital is an institution in which, again, in the US, most families choose to give birth. But a hospital as an institution is designed for the reason of caring for the sick or the injured. Giving birth doesn't equal being sick or injured, but that's what the institution exists for. So that's how you might be treated. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from the manual that I use and all participants in my Birth Words in-depth workshop for birth workers receive a copy of this manual. That's where this quote is coming from when we are talking about the effect of giving birth in a hospital institution. So it says, hospitals exist to provide treatment for sick or injured people. Yet when a birth giver arrives at the hospital, she's normally neither sick nor injured. Rather, birth givers are at the very pinnacle of health and life, even bringing forth new life. But the conventions of the hospital, the institutional underpinnings of its very existence, are to treat the sick and injured. And too often, birth givers are appropriated into this system as hospital, quote, patients. This cultural norm can affect how birth givers see themselves. And then the next activity that we do in the in-depth workshop together is read a story of a first-time mother pregnant with twins who tells her story, positioning herself rather as an object to which things happen, right? As a subject rather than being an agent or a subject in her own story. She kind of talks about birth as if it's something that happens to her. And then we reflect on how the hospital institution can maybe perpetuate problematic things like that. So another definition for institution, rather than like the actual physical institution of the hospital, can mean a significant practice, relationship, or organization in a society or culture. And that definition I just read comes from Merriam-Webster. Again, it's their third definition because it's not necessarily the most used definition for the word institution. But again, it can mean a significant practice, relationship, or organization in a society or culture. With regard to this definition of institution, childbirth in the U.S. typically takes place in the institution, the practice of obstetrics. And there is so much that we could go into obstetrics. I'm going to just mention a couple of quick things, one of which was mentioned during an earlier episode 22, which was an interview with Maggie Quinlan, who was talking about, we focused on infertility, but it came from her book, You're Doing It Wrong, about the history of birth and early parenthood and the effects of historical institutions. And she got into, well, I guess I was summarizing part of her book in that episode and talked about Marion Sims, who was a doctor in the 1800s who's often called the father of modern gynecology. And here's a quote from that episode. I said, and then others, like Marion Sims in the 1850s, saw women's bodies as machines that need to be fixed by an expert mechanic. Even today, treatments are often overly fixated on the problems of the body and the experts who can fix them. This, again, was me summarizing Maggie Quinlan's work, her representation of Marion Sims. If you research a little bit about Marion Sims, you won't want to research for very long. He performed a lot of ethically questionable surgeries, and the most trying part was that he practiced his surgical techniques on enslaved Black women without anesthesia. And much of the basis for the racial inequities and care in the maternity care system today can be drawn back to this sort of treatment. And And I'm not saying that he was solely responsible. There are many other factors as well, and continue to be many other factors. But this is one of the roots of systemic racism in the institution of obstetrics that continues to bear really ugly fruit even today. So, wow, we've talked about environments and institutions in figured worlds that are the typical birth experience and where they've come from and why they are that way. Let's talk about a little bit of a flip side about environments and institutions. If we are actively working to create more positive birth stories and craft more positive figured worlds, those simplified mental images through our conversations with others about birth, what can we emphasize? I believe that the environments and institutions of birth, whether it's home or in a hospital, in a birth center, the key here is that when the treatment of birth recognizes and responds to the uniqueness and individuality of each birth giver, rather than erasing their differences, we're beginning to honor the act of giving life and those who do it. Unfortunately, historically and modernly, much has been done in the process of birth, in a hospital institution, in a medical institution, to try to erase the individualities of birth. Friedman's curve is, we've talked about it in the episode on failure to progress, that we expect that people will make the same sort of progress throughout their labor, a centimeter an hour, and that if you're not, then you're not following the norm. And a lot of other procedures and protocols can be enacted in the process of birth to try to normalize the process of giving birth. And they erase those individualities and uniquenesses and differences that really honor the unique process of bringing life into the world. Again, I never want to say that these should entirely be done away with, any sort of medical interventions. Those that are done truly for medical care, of course, should remain. But I feel that they're often overused to serve normalcy and making everybody's patterns and experiences look the same. And I believe that is a problematic use of those sorts of interventions. Okay. The last topic for today is values. What do we value in the figured world of birth? Anybody who's spent any sort of time on social media in a group that discusses birth in any way has encountered kind of this dilemma about, well, healthy mom and baby is what's most important. That's what we really value. And oftentimes as a doula, when I'm talking with my clients, they always want to make sure that they're clear when they're setting goals for their birth, that first and foremost, we want a healthy baby and a healthy mom. How do we show we value this? Unfortunately, sometimes the way that it's shown that we value it is lots of monitors and tests and interventions. And again, some are absolutely in place, but oftentimes they're overdone to the extent of overemphasizing that this is the only value in birth, is healthy mom and healthy baby. Let's take a minute to think, for example, of another thing that we ought to value more in the birth experience and afterwards is the mental health of the birth giver. Postpartum mood and anxiety disorders can be linked with traumatic birth experiences or the birth giver feeling that she was not well cared for during the birth experience. You've probably heard that quote by Maya Angelou. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. How do we show that we value how a birth giver feels giving birth? What might it look like to value that? Rather than offering answers to this question, I'm going to leave you with that question to think about as I close this episode. I also want to close by continuing to acknowledge my limited perspectives and assumptions and my open invitation for you to share your experiences with me, feel free to reach out through DM or PM on Instagram or Facebook at birthwords, or to email me at birthwordspodcast@gmail.com. Have a great week.
If you're interested in sharing your ideas or experiences on the podcast, go to birthwords.com. If you're liking what you hear, please leave a review on your podcast app. For more resources about language for a better birth, subscribe to the monthly newsletter at birthwords.com and follow Birthwords on Instagram and Facebook.